Americans killed during World War II, no group of servicemen and women performed with more grace, determination, and bravery than its Navy, Marine, and Army Air Corps pilots who flew the bombers, fighter planes, and transport planes, which were key to the Allied forces' victory. In all, 50,000 American airmen lost their lives over Europe alone. And for fighter pilots, while completing the required 30 missions, a fighter pilot's chances of being killed were an astonishing 71%. It is a privilege to have as our guests today 3 gentlemen, 3 pilots, 2 transport pilots, and 1 fighter pilot who served our country with great distinction. I'd like to introduce them to you. To your left is Earl Flanagan. He was born and grew up in Jamaica. He graduated from Jamaica High School in 1940, enlisted in the U.S. Army Air Corps, in which he served from 1942 to 1946 as a transport pilot of the 1st Air Commando Group in China, Burma, and India. After his discharge, he married a former Portia Paulhumus, who later became the longtime beloved editor of the Southampton Press, and he also became a father to a son, Gil Flanagan, who's with us today. Hello, Gil. Thanks for coming. He finished his English degree at Hofstra University, earned a master's in English at Columbia University, and joined the faculty at the Southampton Public Schools in 1950, where he remained a uniquely popular and respected teacher, including he was my teacher. So he was a persevering teacher. He was a patient teacher. And he also served as head of the English department until his retirement in 1984. Over the years, he also served as an adjunct professor of English at Hofstra, at Delphi, and at Southampton College. From 1973 to the present, Earl Flanagan has been the owner and operator of Southampton Aero Service, specializing in serial photography. Please welcome Earl Flanagan. If you see a little airplane flying over your house, it could be Earl.
Don't shoot.
Next to Earl Flanagan is Ed Coral. Born and grew up in Southampton, New York, our local man today. After graduating from high school, Ed Coral gave up an offer of a 4-year music scholarship to enlist in the U.S. Army Air Corps in 1942, and spent part of his flight training with our third guest, Artie Lasker, and I should say they've been friends ever since. During his service, he served as a transport pilot with the 14th Air Force Flying Tigers in China, Burma, and India until his discharge in 1946. Ed, as well as his brother Al, who passed away recently but served with great distinction over 4 years in World War II, returned to Southampton after the war. He married, started a family, and both men joined their father, William Coral, in William Coral and Sons. In 1952, he and Al took over the leadership and formed Coral Brothers Builders, from which he retired in 1985, passing along the reins to his son, Billy Coral. Over more than a half-century, Coral Brothers has maintained a reputation for excellent craftsmanship and integrity that is unparalleled. Ed Coral is married to Julie Coral, who is here. Hello, Julie. And is the father of 4, one of whom, Linda Coral, is in the audience. See why we sort of packed the audience. He's the grandfather of 10. and the great-grandfather of 5. He does not look old enough to have this distinction. And he enjoys playing golf, and he also, and I can attest to this, he plays the piano and he plays it very well. Thank you so much for being here with us. Please welcome Ed Coral. Our last guest today, who traveled all the way with his wife Marilyn, who's here today. Marilyn, hello Marilyn, from Bristol, Rhode Island. It sounds like a great distance, but they had car trouble, so it really was a major feat that they got here. Is Artie Lasker. Artie was born and grew up and attended schools on Staten Island, then before the war, enrolled at NYU. Wanting to be able to join the Army Air Corps, he thought ahead and earned a pilot's license in 1939. And on July 4th, 1942, he enlisted in the U.S. Army Air Corps and spent the war years as a fighter pilot in the Pacific. After peace was declared, he was a member of the Allied occupation forces in Japan on the island of Kyushu. After his discharge in 1946, Artie Lasker continued his studies at NYU School of Law, passed the New York bar exam, and went on to enjoy a distinguished career as a judge in New York City. He retired in 2003 and moved with Marilyn to Bristol, Rhode Island to be near their family. He is currently writing a book, and the title is The Truth, the Whole Truth, and Nothing But the Truth.
Question mark.
And we look forward to reading that book when it is published. We're very grateful to you, Artie, for making the trip to be here with us today. Please welcome Artie Lasker. All right, before we start talking about the war itself, let's just get a little bit of background, and I'm going to ask you folks to give us a general feeling, if any of you have it, among your family and families and friends, about the level of awareness of Hitler's activities and how the general feeling about the war before Pearl Harbor. Ed, could I ask you
Sure.
to comment on that?
As a teenager back in the 30s, it was common practice for my uncle and my father almost every night talking about what was happening in Germany. And I grew up with a feeling of politics being an important part of our lives. And we watched this guy, and we knew he was in big trouble. But at that point, as a young 15, 16-year-old kid, I wasn't that concerned about, getting way over there. So that's my memory.
Do you think your father thought it might happen, or?
I remember him saying that I think they should draft the old men and let these kids stay home.
Okay.
But my mother said, if the Germans saw you and they said, boo, you guys be trying to get back across the ocean. Old 50-year-old guy.
What about you, Artie and Earl? Do you have a comment on that, about general feelings about whether we should or would get involved in the war before Pearl Harbor was attacked?
Oh, there's no question. In 1939, I started to fly airplanes in order to be ready to get into the service.
Right, okay. Artie was one step ahead of the action here. What about the feelings about sort of anti-German feelings in Southampton? Were there? Because there were a number of Germans here. Was it hard to be German at that time?
Well, it evolved. It did develop.
Yeah.
We became suspicious of people who maybe we shouldn't
Yeah,
have.
I've heard that from other people too, veterans.
Just because they came from Germany.
Right.
And, we were a mixture of all nations here,
Right.
as we are today.
Right.
So there was a feeling of suspicion, as I recall.
Yeah. All right. I'm assuming that each of you remembers what you were doing when Pearl Harbor was attacked. Could we ask you briefly, Earl, go down the line here and tell us what you were doing?
I remember I had a little fishing rod repairing business and I was sitting at a bench working on a couple of rods, and the news came over the radio. I was taken aback with the idea that there was this war going on. Well, you know, when you're that young, it really hasn't much impact. But my father was upstairs, so I went up and spoke with him, and he said, well, don't worry about a thing. He said, by the time you're old enough to be in the service, it'll all be over. He was wrong. He was very wrong. Yeah. Insofar as the anti-German feeling, there wasn't a lot of that I can remember. It wasn't a topic of conversation in my family.
Okay. All right, how about you?
I clearly recall sitting in my little 34 V8 at Cooper's Beach parking lot with a buddy of mine with whom I had graduated from high school. Sitting there listening to Glenn Miller, and all of a sudden, we're sorry to interrupt this program, but the Japanese had just bombed Pearl Harbor. And he and I looked at each other. We just graduated from high school, and we said, our lives will never be the same from this moment on. And that's true. It never was the same. And I never saw him again. He went his way, I went my way. We talked once on the phone, but our lives certainly did change.
They certainly did change.
As of that.
And how about you when the news came?
Well, I was playing basketball up at the, not the college, but it was a place where we had athletics and so
Okay.
forth. And all of a sudden we got, people came in and told us to, so I went to home in a hurry to get all the news on the radio as to what was going on.
Right.
And I mean, it was really a shock to the, all of a sudden, we had an attack on Pearl Harbor, and it was one hell of an attack, I'll tell you.
Right.
Really disaster.
Right. Now, obviously, none of the three of you were drafted, you all enlisted.
Yeah.
Was that the defining moment that spurred you on to enlist, Earl?
No, actually it wasn't. I was at Huskerl at the time. When I was in grade school, they skipped us a couple of years because the schools were so crowded that they had to get rid of us. So we got out of elementary school at age 12, so that put me into college at a very early age. And I can remember lying under the trees at Hofstra. It was a beautiful campus, and I was reading or trying to read something, and this was right across the street from Mitchell Field, which was still a very active Air Force base at the time. And it suddenly occurred to me, what am I doing sitting here enjoying all this leisure when other people are not? So I borrowed my father's car that weekend and drove around to the recruitment office at Mitchell Field and signed up.
Okay, good for you. And how about you?
I decided I was going to have to go in service sooner or later, and I said, if I wait to be drafted, I'm going to be carrying a rifle. I think I'd rather be flying an airplane if I can pass all the tests.
Right.
So that's the reason I went to Camp Upton and took the test for aviation cadet program.
Okay. And how about you?
Oh, I went right in.
Right.
I was.
You were already a licensed pilot, is that correct?
I was at NYU. I was a kid, but I started at NYU, and in 1939, I knew that we would be in the war. I knew it, so I wanted to fly, and I got a pilot's license beforehand. So when 1942 came up, I was all set to go, and I went down and was sworn in on July 4th, 1942, into the Army Air Corps.
Okay. Between the time that, Pearl Harbor and you actually physically left, I just want to show that, we had rationing, and I think we had a couple of little chats about remembering rationing, but I think Ed Coral found a couple of tickets there that we wanted to just display. A ration book, which is kind of, you want to just tell about this?
You can pass right if you like.
Yeah, but just tell what was in it,
This, as I remember, I think was for gasoline. You got 3 gallons a week, and they tore off one of the stubs. I think it was like a year's supply, and for each 3 gallons, you lost. I think that was it, but there's another one that was.
There's a little ticket, I think.
I don't remember for sure, but this may be the gasoline. They punched a ticket.
Okay.
3 gallons, that was it.
So what was rationed?
Oh,
Everything.
Okay, what?
sugar. I don't remember. My parents would know that, but I
Okay. Okay. All right. So let's just talk a little bit about your. I mean, I know there were, you know, blackouts, plane spotters. Weren't you a plane spotter, Ed?
I was. I volunteered before I went into service, and almost everybody in Southampton had to spend 2 or 3 hours or 4 hours. My spot was down on the beach,
Okay.
off of Captain's Neck Lane at
Okay.
4 o'clock in the morning or 3 o'clock in the morning till
Wow.
7.
Wow.
And we'd sit there in the winter, cold weather, waiting for any airplanes that might come over, or maybe seeing a submarine out there.
Did you ever see any?
Well, no enemy planes came over here, but
No.
we did have a submarine, as most of you may know, land in Amagansett with German soldiers. So we were alert.
You were alert. Did you have a buddy when you were on duty?
Oh, we always had two.
You always had
We had a
to.
telephone. If we saw a plane, we'd pick up the phone and we'd be connected to a centralized area in, I think it was around Mitchell Field, where they were coordinating the different calls. People calling in, we knew where every plane was on the East Coast.
Now, how did you have a telephone on the beach in 1938 or
Had
whatever?
to have one.
Telephone on the beach?
Oh, yes, well, it was in a house. It was on the roof of a house.
Oh, it was on the roof of the house. Okay. And was this before, this was
This is after Pearl Harbor.
after Pearl Harbor, but before you went in?
Yeah.
Seems to me from everything I've heard from everybody, the nurses and the other service people, that there was just a tremendous sense of patriotism. Could you talk about that a little bit? Something that we just are not as familiar with today at all.
Well, it was true. There was no question about our approval of the war once we were in. There was a lot of controversy before that. But once we were in, everybody was pitching in. There were scrap metal drives, people had victory gardens, and I don't think that there was any question as to what the object was, which is entirely different from the way things are today. Nobody really knows what the object is, whereas we did. And there was no question in my mind as to why I was going to be in the service.
Okay.
Everyone saved everything. I remember people, my mother rolling up string. Everyone had a victory garden. Everyone planted as much as they could plant for their own food. Tin cans, as you said, metal scrap, any kind of metal was saved to put into the war effort. Everyone was in that war to one degree or another.
And knitting, the women knit, didn't they knit
Well, yes,
clothes for soldiers and?
knitting for Britain or something. Do you
Yeah.
know that?
Yeah.
It wasn't something like that.
Sure.
I think that was it. Knitting for Britain. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But it was something like that. But they were sending sweaters.
You had
to the
blackout
British.
shades.
That was before we got it.
Oh, before you got it. And blackout shades and,
All the windows on the south side of our house had double shades or black shades, and the headlights of our car had to be painted black on the inside down to the bottom quarter, I think it was.
so things were different.
Everyone was involved.
And the other
one way or
thing
another.
is, so many people enlisted, I mean, or drafted or were enlisted. I mean, it was just, right? So many people out of your class, for instance, your graduating classes.
Everybody I knew was in.
Right. It was just,
We all
and
volunteered right away.
you all volunteered. And many women, as we pointed out a few weeks ago, 43% of the civilian nurses in the United States volunteered during World War II. That's just amazing. And they weren't drafted and they didn't have to do it. And And actually, one of them, I want to stand up here, Mary Louise Kelly, age 93. Come on, stand up. Was a nurse in Europe in dangerous conditions. And let me just take this moment to ask all of the people, because I know that Gil Foster is here, who was a tail gunman on a B-17 bomber in the 447th Bomb Group. He was also in the Army Air Corps. And I think there are others, maybe. I'd love it if you could just stand up and we could give you a round of applause. People who were serving in the war. And I don't just mean it. There may be others who served in other wars or who served our country, and we thank all of you who did. Okay, now we're getting into basic training here. First, I understand there was a basic training similar to what infantrymen would go through, and then there was quite an extensive training. Let's go through this quickly, but let's cover it. So let's just talk about the basic training and the various trainings that you received to be pilots.
Well, they started us off as soldiers. We learned how to take orders and march and go out to the dump in Atlantic City and play games out there by crawling through the garbage, which was a very good training for dehumanizing one. But that lasted only a few weeks, and then after that we were shipped into pre-flight.
Okay.
But we learned to be soldiers first.
Okay. How about you want to take up
Well,
where you left
I
off?
was right there with him, even though we didn't know each other. In fact, we haven't really discussed it very much. But I was there in Atlantic City too, and after 10 weeks there, we went to Nashville for selection as to whether we were going to be pilots or navigators or bombardiers, and went through a lot of psychological tests, coordination tests, physical fitness, you name it.
Yeah.
Then we went to pre-flight, and that started our flight training.
It was a long process.
It was a long
Right.
process.
Oh, yeah.
And do you want to talk a little bit about the
Well,
flight,
it
the
was the
pre-flight?
same thing, it was
Right.
the same thing for me
Right.
as Ed. I met Ed when we were in primary flight training. And that's after we went through everything down south with
There
all
were-
the
Pre-flight.
testing. And we were all set to go. So when I got up to Helena, Arkansas,
Mhm.
for primary flight training, there was Ed Coral. And he had been left back because he was ill. And so he was, we were in the same class.
Okay.
So I grabbed a
It
hold
was
of him, we went in and we've been buddies ever since.
Now, this training was rigorous, right? Now, first of all, you stressed the huge numbers of people who didn't make it, who didn't make the cut, right, Ed?
Yes.
And also the honor code and the discipline. Talk about that a little bit.
Well, for every man who passed all the initial examinations for physical fitness, coordination, mental, 16 months later, by the time we finished our education, out of every 100 they told me only 7 actually got their wings
Isn't that
and
amazing?
commissions.
Seven.
And the others have been washed out for a lot of reasons, one of which, of course, was violation of the honor code. If you're sitting next to your buddy and you're having a problem with math or navigation and they watch you looking at his paper, you're out. That day, you're out. The next night, whatever you're out. But they watched us out. They watched the guys out for any infraction, of course, especially as you got into the mechanism of flying an airplane. So it was a tough.
We have the honor code here, which you can come and take a look at later. But I must say, we're reassured that these 3 gentlemen have been very well vetted before we had them here today.
But you know, if I may, a primary flight training where I was with Ed, I had an instructor, and I was already a pilot.
Right,
I already had a license to fly, and I was flying Parker Cubs.
right.
And here I was now in primary flight school, and I had an instructor whose name was Baxter. And Baxter was a real, forgive me, a real son of a bitch. He was giving me the works all the time. And Lasker, you're doing this wrong, you're doing that wrong, you're doing... And I was sitting in the back cockpit, he's in the front cockpit, he's not looking at me, and I thought I was going to wash out when it came time. I thought I would be back being a ground soldier. And all of a sudden, the end of the flying, we got up and to see who graduated. And you look down the list, and there were a lot of guys who were in the school, but very few graduated. There was my name. I ran over to Baxter. I said, thank you, thank you, thank you. I really appreciate it. He says, look, Lasker, he says, you're a good pilot. Nothing out of it, but he says, I had to get you so you did everything that you can be a damn good guy in combat.
Right.
And he saved my life.
He really, they sort of put you through a lot. Earl Flanagan still has a memento from part of his training. What is that? Look at this. This is amazing.
I think it's in my pocket. It shouldn't be.
Want to hold it up?
It's my wristwatch that I was given to use as a pilot, and it's still running because it was made in Sag Harbor.
But
I want to augment something that Artie said about the training. This may sound rather drastic, but I had never been in an airplane before. And at the end of the first week, we were to solo out or be shipped out. 7 days of flight training, of learning how to fly an airplane. And at the end of that 7 days, my instructor took me to an auxiliary field. Originally, it was the reverse of what Artie said. The students sat in the front. And there's a picture of the airplane I learned in tacked up to the wall over there. And the instructor sat in the back. He talked to us through what was known as a Gosport. It was a kind of arrangement whereby he had a funnel on one end of a tube, and you had these tube sprouted things that came into your helmet here. You couldn't talk back to him. Not that you would ever have much to say anyway, but he took me through everything in the first week and then out to the auxiliary field, and I can still remember his saying, Flanagan, get in the back. I got in the back, and the second thing he said was, you take that airplane down and don't bring it back here till it's been off the ground. After 7 days of training in a machine I had never been that close to before, much less been inside of it. But the training was so good, and I know Ed and I have talked this over, the training right from primary on up was superb in that I had no trepidation whatever about taking that airplane off by myself. I had a little trouble getting it back on the ground. But after the third try, I finally managed to stop it.
Was that the dollar ride?
No, the dollar ride is the first one they give you free when you first get there.
Oh.
The dollar ride is the one that was free. You didn't have to do anything. You just sat.
Okay. I mean, skipping ahead, we don't really want to skip ahead, but the amount of responsibility on these pilots to get from here to there. I remember you telling me maybe, Ed, that although I think these three gentlemen were transported by airplane to, as passengers eventually to the Pacific, or China, that some weren't. They were, didn't you tell me that a young pilot was in Fort Wayne, Indiana, was told to get in his plane and fly it to China?
And we're all the same age. We're about 87 years old, and in those days we're all 20, 21. And I was transported to China, but a friend of mine, whom I met later, went to Fort Wayne, Indiana, and was given, we had an oxygen mask fitted, our guns and that stuff. And he was then given a brand new C-47 and a map and said, report to Yunnan, China. And basically, you go to South America, across the Extension Island, to Africa, to Aden, to Karachi, and you eventually get to China.
Isn't that?
He's a 21-year-old kid.
And he had to
We
plot
hardly shaved.
He had to plot his own route, right?
Yeah, and
Well,
related
they
to
gave
that,
up. They gave up.
Yeah.
I want to point out, if you don't mind at this juncture,
No.
what that young man was given as a navigation
Oh,
device
good.
was this, and this, and a set of maps. No GPS.
Hold it there. Yeah, hold it.
This was it. You laid out your course with these two instruments, and from there on it was dead reckoning.
But the educational system of the military, I think, was phenomenal. I don't know how they did it to turn not just pilots into professionals, but tank people, mechanics. I was going to say chefs, but forget that.
Yeah, we'll use that word.
They
And
never,
we'll find
they
out
never
later.
taught anybody how to cook. The guys who were cooking for us, they were mechanics. But anyhow, the educational system was fantastic.
I remember reading at some point that for every pilot who, there were 17, for every
For
airman.
every airman in the air, there were 17 on the ground to keep it in the air.
To keep them
And
moving.
that was the number we had.
Okay.
I'm sure Gil might be able to reinforce that.
Oh, what about the aerobatics?
That I can speak to if you don't mind. Now, Artie had the jump on us because he was already a pilot when he got in.
Right.
When we started primary training, most of us had not flown an airplane. But by the end of 3 months, we were able to do everything with an airplane that anybody could ever do with it. Every single maneuver in that amount of time. And you had to be proficient and accurate. As Artie knows, in a fighter plane, there was no fooling around. So in about 3 months of training, you had to be able to do everything, or you didn't go on to the next stage. You stopped there.
One of the things that I think it may have been Ed Corral talked about was making you identify things in rapid succession, the numbers. Talk about that.
Well,
Ed.
I think it was basic flight school where we started. I remember the instructor saying, before you leave this school, you will learn how to identify every plane in the world in a hundredth of a second. And the way we're going to teach you to do this, we're going to flash numbers on a screen. We'll say 5 numbers at a time, but by the time you leave here, you're going to be able to identify a 10-digit number on the screen, flashed there for 1/100th of a second. And you're going to write those 10 numbers down. And I said, well, this is the end of my career. No way am I going to do that. But we did. We did. At the end of our training, and that 100th of a second is just a splash. And it taught us how to eye coordinate and with our memory, because if a Focke-Wulf had just gone through a cloud into another cloud, we had to know whether that was a Focke-Wulf or whether it was an American plane or whatever. So it was a very important part of our total training.
My commanding officer of the 8th Fighter Group, his name was Cyclone Davis, and a cyclone was quite a guy. But let me tell you, he was on Aoi. He was a pilot on Aoi when Pearl Harbor was attacked. He was already in the Air Forces. And unfortunately, I was trying to get him a Medal of Honor. And it was very, very difficult because I found out that he accidentally on a mission shot down one of the American planes. And so there was no way I could do that. But Cyclone was a terrific guy. He was my squadron, my group commander of the 8th Fighter Group. And
Now, when you were being trained, by the way, did you learn to fly lots of different kinds of planes? At that point, you didn't know what you were going to be assigned to, right? What kind of plane you were going to be piloting?
Yeah, you had to go through primary, basic, and advanced training.
Right.
And at the end of advanced,
then you were assigned.
Then you were assigned, but you didn't know until the end of that training.
Right.
So Ed and I, if I may impinge it on your territory a little bit, Ed and I had both wanted to be what Artie became. He was a fighter pilot flying the P-38 Lightning, the Lockheed airplane. And until the other day, I didn't know that Ed had wanted the same thing. So we were both rather nonplussed to be told that we were going to not only not fly the P-38 Lightning, but we were going to fly this high-speed, 160-mile-an-hour airplane, which was going to be full of people, engines, and all kinds of other things. Artie's the only guy that made it.
Well, I flew when I was, after we graduated, I was sent, Ed wanted to be a P-38 fighter pilot, and he ended up differently. I wanted to be a single-engine fighter pilot. Not P-38s, I'd fly anything. So I went out and I got to fly a P-39. And the P-39 was a lousy airplane. I mean, it was a disaster. And when I was training in it, two guys got killed right away coming in making landings. And so everybody got pissed off, really. And got angry at everything, and we made a big stink about it, and finally we got out of there, and I was sent to P-38 training, which was it saved my life.
Terrific. Now, I do want to disabuse anyone who has the idea that these guys ended up on piloting C-47s because they didn't make the cut for the kind of plane that Artie built, because actually these planes required huge amount of skill, and it's very likely that they were chosen because they were skilled in those ways. They had to tow gliders. Tell about what you needed to know to fly these planes.
Well, they had a need. They needed pilots to fly these planes because they were the backbone of the landings and the invasion of Europe, D-Day, and they needed a lot of C-47 pilots.
And they had to fly using instrument flying. Talk about this plane.
We had to have instrument qualifications, absolutely.
Right. And that would describe what that involves a little bit.
Well, as Ed will remember, probably our chief enemy in the China-Burma-India theater of operations was the weather. So we had to be very proficient at flying on instruments, because once you got into a situation, and there were many, in which you would fly, say, from Burma to China at altitudes between 20,000 and 24,000 feet, you wouldn't see anything because it was similar to flying around inside of a bottle of milk. It was all white. There wasn't anything to refer to except the instruments for something like 6 hours.
Oh.
So we had to be very comfortable with our ability to fly the airplane on instruments. Because when we came into 24,000, that meant we were stacked up at a landing area over 24 other guys, everybody at 1,000 feet. And the radio transmission would be, all right, number one would be let down 1,000 feet, Then number 2 would be allowed to let down 1,000 feet. You didn't see these people, but you knew they were all there going back and forward in the soup. So everybody was very careful to be very accurate on instruments and timing.
Also, talk about the fact that you were called on to tow other airplanes, right?
I went through what they call transition training down in Texas, where we were taught to prepare for D-Day. And I had to tow 2 gliders at a time at night and in formation. So I had one bad experience where they had given me an airplane where the engines were overdue for change, let alone overhaul. And I was barely above a stall all the way around Austin, Texas, flying a very shallow turn. And then I released them. Because I was going to release them, and they knew it.
Right.
And we didn't have a radio communication with the glider pilots. Well, it was all hand signals, maneuvering, I forget. But and then, so I went back to operations and said to them, you never should have given me a plane like this. You almost killed a lot of guys.
Right.
They said, well, that's the pilot's fault. The first pilot is responsible for everything. Don't tell us your troubles. That's the way it was.
All right. Now, okay, so now we're in China, Burma, and India. All right, let's just talk a little bit about the overall nature of your jobs, okay? Down the line. We'll start with Artie this time. Okay, Artie, what were you sent there to do with your fighter plane?
Well, I started off in Nadsab, New Guinea, and our job was to go ahead and shoot down as many enemy planes as we could, going up to the ladder to the Philippines, up to Aishima and Okinawa and so forth, until we could end the war. So we were fighter pilots who had to go and protect our bombers, and we had to go ahead and strafe and shoot down enemy planes. And we had quite a job doing that until finally, I'll tell you
Well,
later
that'll be a
about-
little bit later. All right, so who was your crew?
I was the only person in the plane.
You were the only person.
I was the only person in these P-38 fighters.
Wow.
I mean, we had 2 engines, but we had 1 pilot.
Wow.
And it was me or, somebody else who was flying that.
And how many men and women? I'm assuming it was mostly men. I know there were some women pilots, but how many would be flying with you? Would you be flying in some kind of formation, or were you just
Oh no, we would fly in formation,
formation?
going out on a mission.
okay? And how many other fighter pilots would be out there on that same mission?
Well, it depended. The last one, we had all 63
Okay.
planes went out on one mission in order to end the war. But before that, we didn't have that many planes go out on a mission. We might have had 3 or 4 groups of 4 planes each.
Okay. Were there many days that you lost planes, that you lost men?
Oh, of course. Of course. We lost so many men.
Oh.
So many men. We're very fortunate to have gotten back.
Yeah, yeah.
But we didn't think about it. I mean, you couldn't,
Right. I
that
mean,
wasn't it. We had a job to do, and that's what you did.
so you would just wake up in the morning and do what they told you to do, and
That's right. We got,
Hope you
we were assigned
made
a
it back.
mission, assigned a mission, and go do it.
okay. Ed, how about you and your job over there,
You know what?
and what you did with your C-47?
Well, I was
The overall nature.
I was at the end of a long supply line. It started in America. It ended up with guys like Earl Flanagan, the terrible hump, and bringing us supplies. And from there, I had the job of delivering the material, war materials, to the Chinese nationalists, ground troops. And many of my missions were so-called drop missions, because there weren't little fields to land on down in Burma, where we fought a lot against the Japanese. So we dropped things. Some by parachute, but mostly what they call free fall. The back cargo door of our plane was always off, so we'd have a crew of 3 or 4 men in the back, and when I gave them the light, they would push everything out, and it would free fall down, and hopefully to the hands of our allies. Unfortunately, one of my first missions, I waggled my wings, I found the drop zone, and they waved back to me, and we made 3 passes, and they dropped everything out, and they waved back, and I waggled my wings, and I headed back home. I got a call from my home base, don't drop that load, don't drop that load. I said, why? He said, we just found out the Japanese took over that drop zone about an hour ago. I said, I ain't going back. So anyhow, we never knew.
Okay. When you talk about flying over the hump, you're talking about the Himalayas?
Yes, that's where we were, yeah. And they all came over and I was there. We were pretty much in the same spot.
Okay.
And
wait just one second. We're going to turn our tape. All right. Oh, wait. We got enough. So you want to continue talking about?
no.
Okay. So you and Earl Flanagan were both transporting material, men, supplies, medicine, but yours was a slightly different.
Well, in the main, Ed's job and mine were the same. I had to do a lot of drop missions as well. I had one chap who really regretted having said what he said to me over the radio because we had done a drop and we could communicate with the drop zone. And he said, you know, can't you please get a little closer because there's a big ravine behind our camp here and you're dropping everything in the hole and it takes us a long time to get it. I said, okay, fine. So the next time we came around, we put it right through the front door. And it took out the back wall of the encampment. And he called up and said something very mean. I don't think I should say what he said. Anyway, we said, well, you said you wanted it close by.
Yeah.
I will add one other part of my duties, and that was my squadron had to work very closely with the OSS, which is the squadron of the CIA. And for some reason or other, I was chosen often to perform these missions where I would drop an OSS agent. And these fellows were tough guys. They weren't kids. They were 40 years old or more. And they knew what they were doing. I remember dropping one 200 miles behind enemy lines. And then a week later, it happened at nighttime. And as Earl said, our navigation wasn't all that great. And we let him off, and we said, we hope we're in the right spot, but so long. So a couple weeks later, I had to go down and supply him. And first, when I finally found him, he said, I hope you have fighter cover. I said, I hate to ask you why. He said, well, he said, I'm surrounded by the Japanese, and I thought a fighter can keep them busy while you make the drop. And I have to have this drop right in my hands, otherwise it's no good, they'll have it. So we went in and had to make 3 passes at a very slow speed, as slow as you can get, so you put it right in his hands. And while I'm doing that, you can see these guys with the rifles shooting bullets at me. And I'm thinking all I need is just one bullet to go through that windshield, or through a hydraulic line or whatever, and adios, goodbye, mama. So fortunately, they didn't hit me in any serious way. But that was part of my duties.
Who were your crew, by the way, in these big planes? They were big, right?
It was a large airplane. What do we have, 96 feet of wing?
Yeah.
That's big.
96 feet. We were only a little bit short. I think we were 4 feet short of the B-17 wingspan. It was a large airplane, but Ed and I both had a co-pilot and a radio operator and a crew chief, a mechanic. That was the
Okay.
That was the crew.
And one more story that I want you to tell. We were talking about just the scariest moments, or some particularly scary moments, because there must have been a lot of them. But you talked about one time when you were ill and your your seat was taken by another pilot who,
The
talk about that flight, yeah.
We used to have a physical every month. And one month the flight surgeon said, you've got an infection in your eye and your depth perception is just a little bit off. So you better ride in the right seat as a co-pilot for a couple of weeks until that eye clears up. So they assigned me a guy who had been transferred to our squadron. He had a problem as a fighter pilot and didn't know anything about flying instruments, like most fighter pilots. And anyhow, we're on a mission, and we're on a mission, make this fast I can. I could see the clouds converging with the earth up ahead. Any instrument pilot would have circled up till he knew he was well above the altitude of any mountains in front of us. He didn't. He put it on automatic pilot and climbed gradually up a hill, mountain. And I became a believer that day in a supreme being, because I'm sitting in the right seat and I put on the radio altimeter. He said, "What's that?" I said, "Radio altimeter tells us how far we are above the ground." "Oh." And it goes to 100 feet, 50 feet. I said, "That's it." And a magic hand took the clouds out just like that, just before we were about to hit the peak of this mountain. And I overcame the automatic pilot, and that plane just barely sucked over that mountain and then back into the clouds again. We never did see ground again. And the radio altimeter said, "Now we have more land." Anyhow, that was the day I said, fighter pilots shouldn't be in transports.
Incredible.
See, we kept moving up, starting at Nanzab, New Guinea, and then we went up to Mindoro in the Philippines, and then we went up to Clark Field, and then we finally went up to Aishima, which was off Okinawa. And so we were getting closer and closer to Japan, and that was the main idea, was to end the war in Japan by beating the Japanese. And we kept moving up, and we finally got up to Aishima, and then they had the bombs dropped. They dropped the bomb on Hiroshima, they dropped the bomb on Nagasaki. They still wouldn't give up. And that's when we were...
I tell this story here. We'll fast forward just a second because this is an amazing story. Okay, so talk about that a little bit.
So what happened was...
This is after the bombs had been dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Yeah.
A little bit of a lapse before they
didn't
surrendered.
surrender. The Japs still didn't surrender. It was in August, toward the middle of August. And so we were ordered, Cyclone Davis was ordered to go ahead and get every plane that we had on the ground at Aishima. We had 63 planes, B-38s, and we all got up and flew out to bomb a place called Fukuoka, which was just south of Nagasaki on Kyushu. And we did it, and we had, it was a tremendous victory for us. And our job was to now end the war by, since they wouldn't surrender yet, Hirohito would not surrender yet. So we had this last mission where all 63 were going up. And the general had ordered Cyclone to go up on the west coast of Kyushu and finally, just below Nagasaki, move in and attack from the north to the south and bomb and strafe Kumamoto. But what happened was, flying up there on the mission, Cyclone got a gut feeling that it was wrong, that the general's plan was wrong. And you know, you really don't go and disobey orders. But Cyclone did. And before we got to Kumamoto, he wiggled his wings and he turned right, and we followed him, all 62 planes at this time, followed him, and as we were about to drop down and drop our napalm bombs and strafe, we looked across the sky, and it was black with ACLAT, anti-aircraft fire. The Japanese knew exactly where we were going to be, the time, the altitude, only we weren't there. If we had followed the general's orders and were there in the north, we would have been wiped out. We would have lost at least 30 planes. I wouldn't be here today. But by Cyclone's going in below that and going from the south, we went in, we dropped our napalm bombs, we strafed, and 2 days later, they gave up.
That's a remarkable story. We have just a relatively short time, unfortunately. But we can't resist hearing just a little bit about your living conditions. Because they were horrible. Your living conditions?
Oh.
Primitive, all of you. It's got to be quick.
30 seconds, I can tell you, in 1 year, and a little over a year, I was in China. I never had one hot shower. I never had one clear glass of clean water. And what we would do, we would get water, it was muddy, but had been boiled, so it was potable. And if we're lucky enough to get a clean, clear gin bottle, a clear bottle of any kind, put the water in there and let the dirt settle down for about 2 days. In 2 days it would usually settle down. Then if we carefully sipped it without shaking the bottle, it wouldn't eat all the dirt in the water. But I never saw clean water in a year.
Now, you had a different method for cleaning water, right? You didn't.
Well, we didn't, we weren't that primitive. No, we actually had a steel tank into which they threw not only the water, but some kind of pill which killed everything that was in the water. It tasted marvelous, but it was drinkable.
Now, Ed, you lost weight.
I went over 172 pounds, which I am now, and in 4 months' time, I went from 172 to 125.
Oh my God.
My first meal,
You didn't like the cooking.
my first meal in China, it was late in the day, and in a tent, and no lights, and they gave me what I thought was a bowl of beef bouillon. It looked like it, but I'm a fussy eater, so I had to see what I was eating, because I'd just eaten something I never tasted before. I took it outside, and there were 3 worm maggots.
Oh, God.
And that was the beginning of my diet. The conditions were terrible.
Water buffalo, etc.
Water buffalo was the only beef that we had. We did eat chicken once in a while,
Right.
but mostly our diets consisted of brown rice.
So that was.
I did lose a lot of weight. I got sick.
And we were talking about food being sent from home. Didn't you have some
We
Del
were-
Monte?
We were allowed a small package every month, and it was our rule to share it with your tent mate.
Right.
And one time, one of us got a little jar of fruit salad, and we opened it up, and this buddy of mine, who eventually became a minister, and I can see why, he said, on the one condition we're going to share this, we have to learn how to use chopsticks. We can only, and the better you use chopsticks, the more fruit salad you'll be able to get out of the can. So we learned how to use chopsticks. That's a good way to learn.
We'll have some time for questions, and unfortunately, we should do another session here because there's so much to talk about. But in the very few, like 2 minutes that we have left here, I'd like to go down the line and just let me ask you how you think your service in World War II changed you. I mean, we know that it was a huge moment in American history, but what about you, Artie? How did it affect your life, very briefly?
Well, I'll tell you, it made a man out of me. It really did. I was a kid, so to speak, even though I'd been in college. But the service in the military and the job that had to be done, and the guys who I was with, and to do the job, and they did it.
Yeah.
And I'm so proud of all of these
Right.
guys.
Well
I agree. Basically, in two short words, it made a man out of me, and it gave me a different sense of values as to what's important, and a sense of discipline I had never had like that. And it made a different person out of me, and I'm glad I had the experience and survived it.
Right.
I can't add anything to it, it's exactly the same, I grew up.
You grew up.